Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is United States History 201, Presentation 6. So this is the first presentation for material that will be covered in Quiz 2. And what we're going to talk about is actually a number of things in this particular presentation, a lot of stuff to get through. So we're going to look at the American Indian tribes, at least those on the East Coast. We're going to talk about economics in the colonial period, intellectual life in the colonial period, and then ultimately the French and Indian War, which is going to bring us into the time leading to the American War for Independence. So there's actually 4 big topics here. And we're going to get through them, but this is a longer presentation, so hang with me. All right, so let's look at the Northern and Southern American Indian tribes. What I mean by that, not South America in terms of the continent or South America, but the Indian tribes that were in the southern, what would become the southern United States and the northern United States. So we'll start with the southeast, where we are. Here you had what were called the 5 civilized nations: the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And these tribes were generally agricultural, but they were also hunters. They lived in what were called hot houses and shake houses. Hot houses were used in the winter months, and this was common not just for the southeastern tribes, but for the tribes in general. You'd have a large communal house. You might have several families there with a central heating source, and that was to keep people warm. And then the shake houses were more loosely constructed, made of, grasses or bark, things of that nature, to let the breeze blow through in the very hot summer months in the South. Now, generally, these tribes were unified in a confederacy, at least not necessarily the tribes across tribal barriers, but groups within the tribes themselves. You'd have a loose confederacy. So these smaller units would have a tremendous amount of autonomy, but you would still have, for example, in the Creek Nation, you would have Coweta Town, which is where Phoenix City currently is located. You would have the tribes meet there, the smaller units meet there, and then make decisions for the tribe as a whole. Depending on what time you're talking about and who was around, the tribes could be sedentary or militaristic. The Seminole were very militaristic, but the other tribes had that period of time too. But again, there are also periods of time where they were very peaceful and not militaristic. Now, the Creek Indians, as I said, were the dominant tribe in Alabama, and they also went into Georgia a little bit, but they're part of the Muskogee-speaking peoples. And the Creek were very resistant to American encroachment, at least part of the Creek tribe. You actually had a couple of interesting relationships with the Creek tribe. You had William McIntosh, who's pictured here, as a very important leader in the time period leading up to the War of 1812. He actually would be killed by the Creeks for signing a treaty with the United States that they thought undermined the Creek peoples. And that was in the Jefferson administration. And then before that, you had another Creek leader who signed a very important treaty with the United States in 1790 that was actually negotiated in Oswego, which is right near Fort Mitchell. So you actually had 2 distinct tribes in the Creek Nation, the Lower Creeks and the Upper Creeks, and 2 distinct groups. One of these groups would tend to side with the United States, or at least be more agreeable to American expansion. The other was not so much. And so this would actually lead to a civil war in the Creek Nation, which would spill over during the War of 1812. It was called the Creek War. And those who opposed American expansion were ultimately defeated in that particular war. The Cherokee were in Georgia, and they fought periodic wars with the British and the United States in the 18th century. Eventually, we'll talk about this later in the class, they would be removed from their lands, which would be kind of up in North Georgia, because there's gold in that area of Georgia, and so the state of Georgia wanted that land so they could mine it, and the Cherokee were in the way, and so they removed them through something called the Indian Removal Act through the federal government. This became a pretty tense debate between the Cherokee and the United States government, ultimately reached the Supreme Court, but eventually the Cherokee would be moved off land in Georgia. The Seminole tribe was in Florida. It had Creek and African origins. In fact, Seminole means wild men. They were very militaristic, so a lot of these men were either outcasts from the Creek tribe or maybe some from the Cherokee tribe, or they might have been runaway slaves. And so they were very, like I said, militaristic and territorial and extremely resistant to European or American encroachment. One of the most famous chiefs was a man named Osceola, pictured there. Now, the Northeastern Great Lakes tribes were called the League of the Iroquois, and they included the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. They were moose hunters, fishermen. They did engage in some agriculture. They had longhouses, which were very similar to a hothouse, and also a confederacy within these tribes. The Mohawks were important during the American War for Independence, and even the French and Indian War, which was before that. This is Mohawk leader Joseph Brant. He supported the British during the American War for Independence, and he was definitely against American expansion. What you might notice in this painting, and also with William McIntosh, you notice the names. They're European names, and that's because a lot of the leaders of these tribes, as you move forward in time, up until about when you get to the time about the American War for Independence and a little bit before that, you started having leaders of the tribes of mixed blood, meaning that there was European blood, of European and American Indian blood, because when people were moving into the frontier, men were moving into the frontier, they were having children with the Indian women. And oftentimes those children would then be elevated to a status of leadership because they could have feet in both worlds. So Brant is like that, McIntosh was like that, and there were many others. This image was actually made in North Carolina in the 16th century, but you can see the reason I put it here is because of the longhouses, or they might have called these hothouses. Longhouses or hothouses here. These dwellings would have been used for multiple families. And so you would have had, a palisade protecting the camp, of course, agriculture outside the camp, water outside the camp. But this would be used for protection from animals and also other tribes. All right, so that's a brief look at some of the Indian tribes that were here when the British and the French and then later Americans began to settle into the western frontier. Now, what you're also going to have in the 18th century is the globalization of the economy. Land was no longer required to increase wealth. All you needed was paper. And what I mean by that, well, stocks. Europe was becoming much more commercial, and so you get a rise of a merchant class. And Europeans had an insatiable appetite for luxury items. Many of these are cash crops from colonial ventures. So when I talk about cash crops, I'm talking about tobacco, cotton, precious metals, spices, tea, sugar, and coffee. All of these things are coming out of the New World. And of course, that's going to require labor, which eventually led to the expansion of the international slave trade. So this globalization of the economy and acquiring colonies is going to have a tremendous impact on labor, what type of classes we have in Europe, the things that Europeans have, and this is an important trend here in the 18th century, and the future United States is going to be part of this. Now, the African slave trade was also part of international commerce. It was part of what's called the triangular trade, where you had slaves coming out of Africa as labor, and then they would produce cash crops, and then those cash crops would be sent to Europe, and then Europe would send back manufactured goods. The first Africans were enslaved by Muslims in East Africa, and Europeans became involved in the slave trade around the 15th century. At first, African warlords would enslave their own people and then sell them to European merchants, and those European merchants eventually would have access to the interior of Africa, but that wouldn't be for a time. And at first, only non-Christian Africans were bound for life. In fact, the first Africans in North America, in Virginia, were indentured servants, and they were Christians, so they were not bound for life. The first case you have in Virginia of a Virginia law recognizing chattel slavery or people bound for life was actually a black Virginian who said that there was one of his people that he came over here with was his slave. And that person needed to stay slave. So it was actually a black Virginian enslaving another black Virginian for life. That's when Virginia first recognized slavery in that particular way. So the first Africans in North America were indentured servants. They were allowed out of their indentures, and they eventually moved to the frontier, and just like every other indentured servant. Now, the most brutal part of the slave trade was what's called the Middle Passage. This is the route from West Africa to North America, South America, Central America, and most of the Africans who were imported into the Americas went to Central and South America. There were about 11 million Africans imported to the Americas by the 19th century, but the vast majority went outside the United States. In fact, by 1808, the United States had closed the slave trade, and so the only way the slave population would increase was through natural birth rate. And as I said, this very brutal passage. Slave trading was considered to be the most brutal part of the entire episode in American history. And people that were slave traders or had slave markets, they were usually looked down on in society. And 1.4 million people would die on this journey. In fact, the hymn Amazing Grace came from a man who worked on a slave trading ship. So this was seen as a very brutal part of the entire process. And here's a nice map of the triangular trade. So you have labor coming into the Americas. You would have raw materials coming out of the Americas to go back to Britain, and then manufactured goods coming back. Now, I mentioned paper before. So what you had in this period of time is stock markets, stock companies, and state-run banks helping expand credit and expansionary monetary policy. So what they're going to do is start pumping paper cash or paper stocks into the economy. And this is called paper jobbing or stock jobbing. So you didn't need land anymore. You had to do a shuffle paper around. You can make a lot of money. But monetary expansion would lead to inflation and also lead to bubbles, which is the economy is artificially inflated. When the bubble pops, there's a crash. So people that were making a lot of money in the artificial expansion can often be ruined because of that bubble bursting. And governments were very much a part of this. They backed much of the early speculation here, particularly in places like France. And this leads to the rise of state capitalism and mercantilist theory. So we're going to talk about mercantilism. Now, one of the most important individuals in this process was a man named Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was a French finance minister. He centralized the French economy through mercantilism and central banking, which became the model of Europe. Now, mercantilism is a theory that all wealth is produced for the mother country. So you have a positive inflow and balance of trade. It's a closed system. You only trade with your country. So if you're French, you only trade with the French or the French colonies. If you're English, you only trade with England or English colonies. This is why colonies become so important. And you also form state corporations. These corporations are controlled by the state. They monopolize trade. And this was a major problem. The American colonists had problems with these things, and we'll talk about that as we get to the time leading to the American War for Independence. But what this is going to do is allow for greater state spending and also particularly spending on war. It also led to higher debt and eventually a bankrupt economy for France in the late 18th century. England/Great Britain adopted this same economic policy or model around the same period. So the only country that didn't was the Netherlands, and they became very wealthy by just having a free trade mentality. Now, how did the British work the mercantilist theory? Well, between 1651 and 1700, you had something called the Navigation Acts passed. Shipping was closed to all trade outside of England. All goods had to be carried on English ships with English crews. All goods had to be shipped from the English colonies had to pass through England first, or an English customs house. This was an export tax, which are actually illegal under the U.S. Constitution. It also imposed taxes on the coastal trade from the English colonies, and provided for customs officials or tax collectors to enforce these laws. Now, the important thing about this is these navigation acts were often ignored in the years leading to the American War for Independence. It was only after the French and Indian War that the navigation acts are going to be more stringently enforced, and there are some restrictions put on American trade. That is going to be a problem. So they had these things by law. They were codified, but most people just ignored them. A law is only good as what people are willing to enforce. And this was aimed at cash crops. All the tobacco products, rice, indigo, anything that's going to come, timber, anything that's going to come out of the colonies that's going to help the British economy. Now, one of the important economic theorists in this period of time was a man named John Law. He was actually a Scottish economist, but he was a French central banker under Louis XV. He was an advocate of a paper system, meaning there was no coins. He said that stocks were the only thing you needed, a paper economy, and this led to inflation. It also led to state capitalism. So the state is going to be involved in pumping up different areas of the economy, creating bubbles in certain sectors. And in this case, it was speculation through land. So this was called the Mississippi Bubble. And so over here in North America, you had French investors in Mississippi. The land was artificially inflated. When it collapsed, the French economy collapsed. So John Law is one of these guys who thought, well, we can have this paper system. We can inflate. We can trade paper. We don't need hard money. We'll just do that, and people will become filthy, stinking rich. Well, they did, but then also at the same time, when people realized this is an artificial economy, when the bubble burst, a lot of people were ruined, and the entire French government economic situation, the entire French economy was ruined as well. Now, another important economist in this period of time, in contrast to the state interventionist theory or mercantilism, was a guy named Adam Smith. He was also a Scottish philosopher-economist. He's often called the father of capitalism. He wrote a very important book in 1776. The short title is Wealth of Nations. But what he did is he looked at the economic systems being used in Europe and he said, we're doing this all wrong. What we need to do is get out of the economy. The government needs to get out of the economy and leave it alone. That's where the term laissez-faire, that's what it means, hands off or leave it alone. He said the economy will regulate itself through the invisible hand. The consumer, the producers, they'll all regulate. They'll self-regulate because people won't buy stuff if they don't want it. So only things that are viable will survive. He did believe in a little bit of state intervention in the economy, particularly for things that were needed for building up infrastructure, like harbors, things of that nature. But for the most part, he thought the government should be completely out of the economy. It shouldn't promote industry and commerce. It also shouldn't regulate industry and commerce. And that would produce the most efficient type of economy. Now, let's talk about some other intellectual developments. We're going to look at religion, philosophy, education, science, and art. Now, in terms of religion, this is a period of time where you had something called the First Great Awakening. And one of the greatest proponents of that was a man named George Whitefield, who lived from 1714 to 1770. He's often considered one of the fathers of Methodism and evangelism in general. He was an itinerant preacher, meaning he traveled around and preached. He arrived in Georgia in 1738. Then he traveled to all the colonies, from New York City to Charleston on horseback at one point, speaking to very large crowds, perhaps as many as 10,000 at a time. And this was without any type of voice magnification, so he could really project his voice. He said that people should return to the old doctrines of the Puritan Church, become more Calvinistic. It must be noted that Whitefield was actually very pro-slavery. And of course, if you read the Bible in the Old Testament, it's littered with slavery. So he said slavery was sanctioned by God. God said it was okay in the Bible. If you just look at the story of Abraham, it's there. And because of this work, slavery was actually reestablished in Georgia in 1751. It had been eradicated in Georgia, but because of George Whitefield and because of his time in Georgia, slavery was reestablished. And so it's very important to note that the pro-slavery defense, that the religious defense of pro-slavery, actually came from northern ministers, eventually also from people coming from England. Whitefield would die in Massachusetts, and he's buried under Old South Church. Jonathan Edwards was another very important First Great Awakening preacher, gave fire and brimstone sermons. So God was an angry God. Contrast that to, say, the Quakers, God is God of love and light. No, here God is an angry God. In fact, we're all sinners in the hands of an angry God. This is a very famous line that he said. But this attracted many people who wanted to start fresh, including women. This Calvinistic theology, where you are predestined, you can live a bad life, you can do wrong things, but yet God's grace and God's love will still save you. It doesn't matter. Works are not as important as God's grace. And so that's very attractive to a lot of individuals, this Congregationalist type message, and it's really going to take hold in the South. Methodism and Baptists become the most dominant denominations in the South as a result of the First and Second Great Awakening. Now, in contrast to that, you have people like John Locke, who's an English philosopher, helped write the English Bill of Rights in 1689. In fact, could have been the only author of the English Bill of Rights. He's often called the father of classical liberalism or classical republicanism, and he was much more secular. In fact, a lot of the classical liberals or people in this enlightened period rejected religion. Now, his two very important works are an essay concerning human understanding, where he coined the phrase tabula rasa. He basically said all people are a blank slate at birth. If you have people of equal talents and you give them the same nurturing, they're going to be the same. So you can have people who are a better talent but don't have the nurture possible to achieve that talent, whereas maybe people who are born into an aristocratic family have all the nurturing, so they can really hone their skills in a way that someone who doesn't have that ability can do as well. He also wrote an interesting philosophical tract entitled Two Treatises on Civil Government, where he coined the phrase life, liberty, and property. He said that governments have an obligation to protect three things: life, liberty, and property. And you're going to see this, of course, in American founding documents. He said that there's a social contract between the governed and the government. And when the government stops adhering to protecting life, liberty, and property, that social contract is then broken, and people have the ability to change that government. So this is a very important strain of thought moving forward in the United States. Another very important scholar was a woman named Mercy Otis Warren, considered to be one of the first American historians. She knew all the major actors in the American War for Independence, and she wrote a very important book entitled History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution in 1805. John Adams didn't like her. In fact, he said that women should be writing history. But she was such an important figure because of her views on the war, her views on government. She didn't really like the Constitution. She thought it was going to be a disaster for the United States in the long run. Just a really interesting historian. And so you did have women in the 18th century really breaking the mold, so to speak, and stepping out and doing some things in fields that were traditionally considered the realm of men. Mercy Otis Warren, though, was a wife. She did still fit the traditional role of a woman at this time, but she got into this intellectual side, and so you're going to start seeing this a little more and more in the 18th and 19th century in the United States. Now, in terms of education, all the Ivy League schools were founded in this period of time, and most with denominational histories, meaning they were attached to the Baptist Church or the Methodist Church or something Anglican Church, something of that nature. So you had all these Ivy League schools listed there. But it must be noted that most Americans, if they had an education, went to private tutors or they were homeschooled before they went to university, or they went to a Latin grammar school. So you learned the traditional subjects of Latin, Greek, you read philosophy, you learned some rudimentary mathematics, languages, things of that nature. You might study astronomy, a little bit of science, but people were entering college in their they're 16 years old, 15, 16, maybe 17 years old. They would enter college, and they would be finished by the time they were 19 or 20. So they're out a little bit earlier than what we have now. In some cases, you could be out of college by the time you're 18, because you could accelerate through. It wasn't a graduated system where you had to stay a whole year in a grade. As soon as you finished the work for that particular grade, you could move on. So Benjamin Franklin was homeschooled. George Washington was homeschooled. And there's a variety of others, and particularly in Virginia, this happened quite a bit. So these men that we think are just great scholars, great intellectuals, or great leaders, great statesmen, they were being primarily taught at home for most of their life. Now, you also got a smallpox inoculation in this period of time. You had your first general hospital in Philadelphia and your first mental hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now, one of the most important figures in this period of time in terms of science and learning was Benjamin Franklin. Lived from 1706 to 1790. He, in fact, at one time was a fugitive. That should say fugitive from his brother. I'm sorry, I left that off. He was a fugitive from his brother, and he broke his indentures. Basically, he was a servant in his brother's. He was an apprentice in his brother's shop. And when he fled, he became a fugitive, essentially, from the law. Now, his brother could have asked to collect him. He was bound to his brother's shop, but his brother didn't. So from that point forward, Franklin was really much on his own. He was a journalist, businessman, author of Poor Richard's Almanac, statesman, scientist, diplomat. Poor Richard's Almanac had a number of very interesting phrases that we all should heed, because they are good words of advice. For example, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. You've probably heard that before. Don't throw stones at your neighbors if your own windows are glass. Haste makes waste, and there's lots of others. And so people would walk around saying, well, Poor Richard says. And of course, Benjamin Franklin was writing these things. He established the first circulating library in the United States. He wrote on a variety of topics: weather, earthquakes, geography, climate, agriculture, economics, physics. He discovered that nor'easters move against the wind. So a nor'easter is a very severe winter storm in the Northeast. He established the American Philosophical Society. It's known as the American Sage. His autobiography is one of the best-selling American works. He was also, an inventor. For example, he invented the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, and bifocal glasses. But you also had other inventions in this time period: the long rifle, which was developed in Pennsylvania. Flatboat, which is invented by Jacob Yoger. The Conestoga wagon in this period of time. David Bushnell invented the first American submarine. This is a tremendous period of intellectual and scientific growth in the United States. Now, art. So let me look at some of the, we're going to briefly look at some of the important American artists in this period of time, in this colonial period leading into the early federal period. So one of the most important artists was a man named John Singleton Copley. An American portrait artist, helped teach Charles Wilson Peale the trade, and portraits in his work would involve everyday items, and there were some very famous ones. So this is what Copley looked like. But here is his portrait of John Hancock. Everyday items like a ledger, the quill, So he would go around and paint some very important individuals in this period of time leading to the American War for Independence. Paul Revere, he was a silversmith, so there he is working with his trade. Samuel Adams, again, Adams with everyday items. So what I would want you to do for this is be able to identify who painted what. So Copley painted these paintings. Then you had Benjamin West, who was considered as one of the greatest American painters. In fact, at one time was called the American Rembrandt, because he was so prolific and painted such important things in American history. But this is his painting, Death of General Wolfe, painted in 1770. General Wolfe was a British general during the French and Indian War, and it's one of the most famous paintings in American history. He also had this, Benjamin Franklin drawing electricity from the sky, painted that in 1816. So again, here's the American sage, Benjamin Franklin, working on his lightning rod invention. Charles Wilson Peale was an American patriot, soldier, and more famously a portrait artist. He's from Maryland, but eventually settled in Pennsylvania. Established the first museum in America in 1801. Here's his painting of George Washington in his Virginia militia uniform. This painting of Washington at Princeton. It sold in 2005. This painting did for $21 million. So that's a pretty hefty sum for a painting. Here's his portrait of Thomas Jefferson. All right, so that's art. Again, portrait art was the most prominent feature of American art in this period of time. So last thing is the French and Indian War. This will just take a few minutes to get through, but what you see, because we've already talked about the French in Quiz 1 material, we know the French are here, we know the English are on the East Coast, so the French and English would wage war either cold or hot for much of modern European history. By the 17th century, England and France began competing for North American colonies. Again, the French are kind of in the interior, the English are along the coast. So early French interest was confined to fur trading and fishing, and though France set foot in North America before England, there were no large French settlements in North America before the 17th century. In fact, in 1608, you had Quebec. Now, eventually, you're going to get hot wars, which are wars that you're actually fighting. There were actually 4 world wars fought between France and Great Britain in the 18th century. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. And that's the important one for our purposes. The French and Indian War had a profound impact on the future of the British North American colonies. So it lasted from 1754 to 1763. It was the 4th of the world wars between Great Britain and France. The war ended salutary or beneficial neglect in the British North American colonies because it's going to be very expensive, and the British Parliament wants the American colonists to pay for this war. British trade and tax policies are rarely enforced between 1607 and 1763. I talked about that. And so the end of the war and subsequent taxes and legislation created tension between the Crown and the colonies, which helped lead to the American War for Independence. So important people or events of interest: George Washington, the Albany Congress and the Albany Plan of Union, William Pitt the Elder, and the Treaty of Paris. These are the 4 major things I'm going to talk about. So first and foremost, George Washington. This is where we're first introduced to George Washington. He comes from a Cavalier family. He began his military career during the French and Indian War, and he was a man among men. In fact, Washington had a really interesting time before this. He spent a lot of time on the frontier as a surveyor. So here's a guy that was well acquainted to frontier life, even though he was a gentleman and he was the best dancer in the air, best athlete, well-mannered. Washington also was a real man. He went on the frontier, he knew how to hunt, he was a good soldier. So George Washington was a well-rounded individual. The Albany Congress, actually, when I talked about the Albany Plan of Union, in 1754, you actually get a meeting of the colonies in Albany, New York, and they talk about actually forming a union. This, in fact, this cartoon is drawn by Benjamin Franklin. It's considered the first American political cartoon. What he's saying is we need to join together in some type of defensive pact, or we'll die. So you see all the pieces of the snake are chopped up, but if you put them all together, you're in a much better situation. The colonies, though, did not favor union, and that's because Franklin said this: the colonial assemblies and most of the people were narrowly provincial in outlook, mutually jealous and suspicious of any central taxing authority. The United States, one of the traditions is they don't want central taxing authority. They don't mind if the people close to them are taxing them, because they see that. But what they don't want is a central authority taxing them. Now, I mentioned William Pitt the Elder. Favored using everything at his disposal to win the war in the British North American colonies, which is going to lead to higher taxes in both Great Britain and America. You're going to get war loans that were never repaid. That sounds familiar. The United States has loans it will never repay. Pitt supported the American position during the time leading to the American War for Independence. So he recognized that the British trying to clamp down the colonies was problematic at best. To make a long story short, the British will win the French and Indian War. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. George Washington played a pivotal role. He, in fact, was involved in the first fighting of the French and Indian War. In fact, he was almost killed in the French and Indian War early in the conflict in 1755. But he makes it out. You had some very famous engagements in Quebec, and ultimately the British will win. So, according to the Treaty of Paris of 1763, France will cede all of New France east of the Mississippi to Great Britain. Spain will cede Florida to Great Britain. And so the British now control most of North America. But again, the French and Indian War was an expensive endeavor, and this is ultimately going to lead to the destruction of the British North American Empire. And so world wars, very expensive wars, and lots of wars will tend to destroy empires, and that's something that I think is educational for people looking back on history and thinking what we should do now in the modern era. Okay, well that's it, and I will see you for presentation 7.